Today's session is going to be meeting the IFBTA board, but what it really is a virtual chapter meeting of which we've been introducing over the last few weeks various IFBTA board members to share their insights for their organizations and the industry. But as with any chapter meeting, it's then opened up to everyone for an open mic discussion, as we would do on whatever is top of mind for you. So today we're starting with the welcome, which you just got. We'll do housekeeping. I'm going to give you a quick update on the IFBTA itself, and then we'll go to the board presentation, and then we'll have the open mic discussion for today. As far as our housekeeping is concerned, any questions that you have, please do it via the chat button. You can address your question as to whether it's for the whole board or whether it's just for one particular speaker. And also, you should stay away from disparaging remarks, questions, comments regarding sales and pricing, political discussions. You are going to be muted during the live part, but when we go to open panel, the open mic discussion, it would be great to have both your cameras and your mics on, because that really is your discussion, not ours. And we all like to share, as we normally do when we get together in person at things like that. But for now, if you're not one of the presenters, we would appreciate if you turn off your microphones so that we don't get any background noise. Let me just give you a very fast update, because we don't have the opportunity to do an annual meeting with our membership. And so we've been presenting it on the calls. And for those who've been on the last two calls, well, you'll get to hear it one more time. 2020, as we all know, was a very interesting year. We had 10 chapters and a virtual chapter. We did 23 chapter meetings, both virtual and in person. We did do events at the beginning of the year with the NRF, the International Food Service Expo last March, and my very last plane flight, as many of yours, was coming back from MERTEC, where we had a celebration of technology on March 11th. We did over 52 separate webinars, not only on our own, but also in support of other groups in associations and around the world: Singapore, Japan, Russia, United States. And last week, we actually did one in Japan as part of a food service technology conference there. We announced during the year the partnership with the New York State Restaurant Association, and we continued our alliances with the National Restaurant Association, actually doing some joint gatherings with them and other calls, our presentations and things with the National Retail Federation, and then with Clarion events in support of their shows, which unfortunately were all canceled, but they went virtual, so we participated in that. We expanded our board, and I'll share that with you in a minute. And also, we continued to do industry participation through the certification program, which many people chose to take while they were working remotely. And it's an interesting side item that we had over 22,366 attendees to all of the different things that we're talking about throughout the year. 2021, the board is working aggressively on a number of different things, adding 5 virtual and local chapters, some of which were in the works before 2020, but obviously got put on hold. Continuing the strategic alliance program with state restaurant associations, other associations, and of course, events and media. Increased presence at industry events. We were supposed to be in New York, which is in the process of under consideration as to what's happening with that, but we're not sure because it's coming right up. But California and Florida, and then our enhanced certification program, adding new modules and targeted areas. Support of industry education with universities, and we'll be announcing shortly our first one. And we've added 2 new staff, which the announcement went out this past week. And obviously, we're looking to increase our participation engagement with all of you. So with that, this is our IFBTA board as it exists today. We've expanded it, I believe, by about 3 members. And they really represent all kinds of different areas of the industry itself. And we try to have a well-rounded board, including internationally, but also focused on each individual area as well. And so today we're going to hear from 2 of our board members. Next. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Now, you will note that Umara Marshall from Marriott was to be on this call as one of our speakers, and she had a last-minute business thing come up, and we all understand that. And unfortunately, the IFBTA webinar today was not one that she could actually make. So our speakers are going to be my boss and chairman of the IFBTA, Lou Grandy, and Vikram, who actually is the head of technology at Nando's and works out of London and also represents us internationally. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and start this by asking each of them to give you a little bit background. That's the idea of meeting our board, on their background, their organization, and some of the key things that are top of mind for them. And then we'll go into a moderated discussion followed by the open mic. So Vic, do you want to start?
Hello, good morning, everyone. Nice to meet you. Thanks, Rob, for the brief intro there. So yes, I work for Nando's Restaurants, group head of technology, effectively. For those that don't know Nando's, because we haven't got a big presence in the US, we operate in 26 countries, we've got around 1,300 restaurants. The brand actually started in South Africa. It's an Afro-Portuguese concept, flame grilled chicken concept. It's incredibly popular in the UK, where I'm based. In terms of the way that we're structured, it's a very federated business. It's grown organically, it's still family owned. I work obviously in a global group capacity, sitting at the center here in London, where our group team is predominantly based. And in terms of what's top of mind for us at the moment, obviously, I've been working heavily with each of our market CIOs, supporting the embedding of a lot of technology in response to COVID. So we've accelerated the pace at which we've rolled out delivery across the estate. We've looked at things like order at table, virtual queuing solutions to help people get back through the doors of our restaurants, but also increase our off-premise growth, so that we've, when the restaurants are closed for dining, we've been able to capture sales. Now that we're sort of coming out of the other end of that, the interesting thing for us, and the thing that we're talking about, is the physical restaurant footprint that we had, which was predominantly 80% dine-in business. What does that model look like as we emerge out of the other end of COVID? And how do we digitally enable that experience to reduce friction out of the experience now that customers have been experienced to a new way of transacting with us? So those are that's really the big thing that I'm interested in, really sort of pushing across the group for Nando's.
Great. Rob?
Thanks, Rob. Good morning or afternoon, as it is for Vic over in the UK. Lou Grandy, I'm the Senior Vice President of IT for Red Lobster. I've been a technology IT leader in the industry since the mid-90s. Prior to that, I was in consulting, and prior to that, I was a restaurant operator for 8 years. So restaurants are in my blood. It's what I do. It's what I love. I would say, ditto to everything Vic just said has been our experience at Red Lobster over the last 12 months. Fortunately, we in 2017, we started building out our digital platform to support off-premise and off-premise growth. And so when the shutdown happened at the end of March, we basically had the foundation and had built on that foundation for an off-premise business. Certainly taking restaurants offline for in-restaurant dining put a lot of pressure on the operators to really understand and learn how to run off-premise. So we've continued to make incremental investments in the off-premise experience, the integration of loyalty in the off-premise and on-premise dining experience. And now that the restaurants are starting to reopen and people are starting to come into the dining rooms, the biggest challenge that we have is just managing that dual demand, because we're not seeing material decline in the off-premise demand, but we are experiencing the fact that people like to go out to eat. And as the dining rooms are opened and more folks in the US are becoming vaccinated, we do see that in-restaurant demand spiking pretty dramatically week after week for the last 2 or 3 weeks. We own and operate a little over 700 restaurants in the US and Canada. And then anything outside of the US, South America, Central America, Puerto Rico, the UAE, Japan, Malaysia, All of those are franchised, and we have about 50 restaurants internationally, in addition to the 706 or so that we have between Canada and the US. The majority of our restaurants are in the US. We've got 677 here in the continental US, including Hawaii, no restaurants in Alaska, and we haven't been very successful tapping into the main market. That just seems to be their backyard, and but that's where we are.
So thank you. You know, both of you actually said one thing that I think has been a point that's come up a number of times for people. Both of you are in some new areas that you hadn't expected to be. Lou, you just talked about how do you manage dual demand, you know, of an off-premise market that you might not have had before, and hopefully you're going to maintain. And Vic, you actually sort of talked about the same thing, that, you know, there's some new pieces here. And I'm just, when you talk about managing it, there's a number of different ways to look at that. One is, you know, physical plant, you know, another is staffing people, but also there is a technology component to it that may be adding some things you might not have had before. I thought maybe both of you could talk to some new business models you're doing because they've now been identified and you believe they're going to continue.
Lou, should I go first on this?
Sure.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So, yeah, look, I fundamentally, what it's forced Nando's globally to look at, you know, when you steer into being a predominantly dine-in business, we've been less, because we sit in the fast casual space, we've been less focused on speed, order accuracy, those kind of things haven't really been that important, right? So there's always been demand there. We can get food out of the kitchen within 15 minutes, that's okay. But the off-premise customer has a very different expectation, right? The order needs to be accurate, you want it quickly. And so the expectation of an off-premise guest is very different. And, you know, typically, especially in our largest market, the UK, we haven't run that business, you know, it hasn't been data led. We haven't been, you know, managing to speed of service. We haven't been looking at ops audits, you know, in terms of operational excellence compared to a QSR brand. I worked at McDonald's for 5 years prior to Nando's. We're a million miles apart from how they operate restaurants and how we do. And we need to, you know, we need to get somewhere in the middle. So in terms of new system, you know, we didn't have a kitchen management or a KDS solution in the UK for expediting orders and sort of that track speed of service up until the order left the kitchen. So we never really even knew how well we were doing. So there are things like that, you know, how do we get visibility of, in reality, where are the bottlenecks in the production cycle? And how can tech support with that piece? Also, how can tech, you know, help with getting product through the system as quickly and efficiently as possible? You know, things around demand planning, making sure I've got the right people in the right place at the right time, with scheduling. All of these things help manage capacity and throughput through a restaurant, and are heavily tech enabled. So, you know, these are things that we've, you know, in our South African business, that's the one market where we are heavily off premise, and we've got drive-throughs in that market. We've ended up adopting a lot of the technology out of that business across the group in response to this, because our channel mix is materially shifted from an 80-20 dine-in, you know, to 100% off premise, right? And now that dine-in is going to come back, and we don't think there's going to be any, you know, theory, you know, in the UK especially, as I'm sure there will be in the US, there'll be mass hysteria when the restaurants reopen and the social restrictions get reduced. So we know we're going to have, you know, the restaurants are going to have massive demand, but we also don't think off-premise demand is going to materially drop away either. So how do we now manage that? And that capacity constraint is a concern. And that's where things like smaller footprint restaurants come into play, stealth kitchens or cloud kitchens. And these are all things that we're looking at as well, right? Like, what does a more off-premise focused kitchen look like? You know, we're looking at lockers, streamlining pickup for delivery riders, all of that kind of thing to help remove friction and the physical touch points that customers or riders need to have with our crew, right? So touched on quite a lot there, but those are the—
Yes, you did. I'm sitting here thinking, all right, you know, I was sitting here taking some notes, and I'm like, all right, this is going to be a tough one, but it will be good for open mic discussion. Lou, I'm sure you're going to add to this list.
Yeah, again, I mean, you know, similar to Vic, we're almost living parallel lives. Again, I'll say one of the advantages that Red Lobster had going into the shutdown at the end of March is the fact that the 3.5 years prior to that, we had invested and put the digital platform in place. So we did have scorecards. We were doing things like performance-based scheduling for servers in the restaurant, and we sort of translated that to the off-premise business. It's interesting. In the 90s, I was in QSR, and as soon as the shutdown happened and we became 100% off-premise across the system for several months, it was interesting sitting in the executive meetings, and they start using the lingo of QSR because they started talking about order accuracy, and they started talking about we always talk about speed of service, but it was usually like check time out of the kitchen, right? Everything's cooked and delivered in 12 to 15 minutes in a restaurant. And so we started scratching our heads. And one of the things we realized is that, well, we probably weren't good with order accuracy for the in-restaurant experience either. But if the expo forgets to put a sauce on a plate or some other, it's never the main entree. It's always something that goes with it. Butter and sour cream for a potato or a salad. The server could always run back to the kitchen and be right out and kind of service that order accuracy issue. So we have spent a lot of time over the last 9 to 12 months really driving home and trying to get into the order accuracy for off-premise, because once the guest or the delivery driver leaves with the order and goes home, there's nothing you can do to recover from that. So we are very, very focused on order accuracy. Again, systems wise, one of the things that we did deploy is curbside check-in, using text messaging to make it seamless for the guest to show up in our parking lot, text here, and then the food's out in the car within a minute to 2 minutes. And then we're following up that about an hour later with a survey. So 2 years ago, we deployed tabletop devices in all of our restaurants, and our surveys just went through the roof because we tied it into the payment process off of the tabletop devices. And we didn't have anything similar to that from an off-premise perspective. But when you're doing 8% of your sales off-premise, which is where we were back in January of last year, to all of a sudden 100% of sales being off-premise, and all of a sudden you're blind to consumer feedback, we very quickly put the survey in place. So that was one thing we did, and then we integrated that into the dashboard that we already had built for the in-restaurant surveys. And curbside check-in also was huge. We are actively working with our 4 primary delivery service providers to figure out a way to leverage that curbside check-in process for the delivery drivers, so that we don't have the delivery drivers having to get out of their car and go into the restaurant. For that reason is the foot traffic. For the other reason is operationally, if we can get the delivery service drivers to check in the same way we get our off-premise folks to check in, then you've got one sort of service model that the operator can execute against. And it really doesn't matter whether that order is coming in through our native e-commerce platform, or whether it's coming in through one of the delivery service platforms. So we haven't quite cracked that code yet. The delivery companies are very open to it. There's no real way for them to force compliance with the drivers to actually check in. So that's one thing that we're working towards an active test with one of our providers to see if that materially moves the needle. The last thing I'll say is, from an e-commerce perspective, payment. So we forced payment for as many restaurants as we possibly could. You start taking on risk there with regard to fraud, or we have had instances where they make these large orders and they either place it at the wrong restaurant, or they're placing it and they don't even show it up. They had no intentions of showing up to pick it up. So we've had to do some things to help with that, and then throttling across all of the channels, the digital demand. I think I mentioned this on one of the earlier meetings last week or the week before. I mean, Mother's Day last year, historically for the industry in the U.S., was just a bloodbath. You know, our digital platform at one point in the early part of the, between the 11:30 and 2 o'clock hour, and we just couldn't react fast enough. We're pushing 250 orders every 15 minutes at these restaurants, and just brought the system to its knees. So we've spent a lot of time since Mother's Day last year coming up with operational procedures of which channels to close down. You start with the least profitable channels, i.e. your delivery platforms, all the way down to the most profitable channels. And you really don't ever want to turn off, you know, our native e-com platform, but you can also order delivery off of redlobster.com. One of the delivery companies does that last mile delivery. So that's really the last channel that we would shut down, would be our own self-delivery. But it's a highly manual process right now, and the operators have the regional managers have responsibility for working with the GMs to throttle that demand.
Well, you know, you both have brought up two subjects. I'm going to ask them both at the same time because they're interrelated. You know, Vic, you brought up a whole bunch of things you're looking at, from lockers to, you know, all kinds of things that are there. And you put in new things. And Lou, you did exactly the same thing. You threw in a whole bunch of things. You're talking about, you know, curbside check-in and all these things. So, you know, there's probably some advice you might give based on whether you did it right or wrong. And I'm not really asking you to admit all your whatever, but integration, that word keeps coming up here a lot, and it's come up on the other calls because people threw things in that they didn't know they were going to do because they had to do it. And sometimes those solutions weren't readily available from the current providers. And so how do you adjust, or what corrections do you make going forward? And then the second part of that question for both of you is, you both also did talk about things you put in that you probably weren't expecting to put in. And I'm just sort of wondering, was there something you didn't think about? Like, I don't know, Lou, if you thought about throttling up front, or whether that was just how it happened, right? And then you had to react to it. So that's really a question for both of you. The integration challenges by putting things in to solve the problems quickly. But secondly, what surprises did you get that you might not have thought about that, you know, you can share with everyone because it might be helpful to them? And so I don't know, Vic, do you want to go first, or Lou? Either one, it really doesn't matter.
I'll take it first, and then I'll pass it to Vic, just kind of follow on. So throttling was something that we looked at prior to the shutdown, but the magnitude of the issue was exponentially larger when all of our business was coming through the digital platform. And then Mother's Day historically is the busiest day of the year for us, probably second only to maybe Valentine's Day. So it was just the magnitude of it. So we are actively looking for ways to get to automated. We call it universal throttling across all of the channels, and using AI and machine learning to have the platform basically throttle automatically based on the demand, and take into account the in-restaurant demand. Because when there is in-restaurant demand, then even the online demand becomes even that much greater. We're not bifurcating the line to produce the food, but we are bifurcating the delivery and the plating of the food for dine-in versus for takeout, with separate physical spaces in our restaurants, which definitely helps. And then you asked about integration. You know, our restaurant solution specifically is a hybrid mix of in-house developed solutions and commercially available solutions. And one of the things that we did with this digital platform was to invest in a cloud-based API integration platform, which has been a lifesaver for us because we're able to move pretty quickly to integrate and communicate with either our internally developed solutions, knitting in other third-party solutions. We're able to react pretty quickly, and that's been a lifesaver for us as well.
Okay, Vic, same questions.
Throttling we have thought of before across the group, but in a pretty clunky way, if I'm honest. So we can take X amount of orders per X minute slot kind of thing that a lot of brands do, and we apply that across channel. It's really clunky, and actually, as we've sort of ridden the COVID wave over the last year, we've found a whole load of strange behavior happening in the restaurants as well that's costing us sales, unfortunately. So, you know, when restaurants are getting overrun, they're putting the third-party aggregator tablets into busy mode, which is throttling demand. They're not switching that off and going back into normal mode, so we're losing sales off the back of that. We've got, you know, decreasing of radius from a restaurant, so that we've, you know, so there's a whole load of stuff that's going on. And in all honesty, in my mind, I think when it comes to the throttling piece, I think we need to get to a place where we've got a realistic view of the capacity the kitchen has available at this point in time. So we surface from the kitchen management solution right now, their average prep time is X, and based on this order and everything else that's in the system, our promised time is Y. And I think that should be served across all channels. I don't think we're there yet, unfortunately, but that's what we're working towards. The challenge that I have at Nando's, unfortunately, is that, you know, the brand's 32 years old. It's grown organically. The markets that we're in, we've got a lot of technical debt as well, which is a big problem. We've got 14 different POS systems. The eco, you know, it's a bit of it's a challenge to scale anything from a technology perspective, and that's where things like a middleware API layer, integration layer, actually been a godsend as well. Like in markets where we are able to do that, we're able to move at pace, but in other markets we're, you know, at the mercy of your Oracle, your NCRs of the world, and them having integrations. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. In terms of the integrations that, you know, in terms of one kind of integration-led story, in the UK, when we rolled out Order at Table, it was more important for us to enable guests. You know, we had to get a solution off the ground within 6 weeks, and it was more important for us to have guests be able to sign in and earn and burn loyalty in that solution than necessarily have POS integration. So we took the hit from a staffing perspective and manually keyed in from a customer perspective, they got a slick experience and they were able to, you know, redeem and earn loyalty points, which was a big deal because we've got a large loyalty presence in the UK. And then we staged the integration over the following 2 months, where we eventually did the POS integration piece. There was a single sign-on. So single sign-on loyalty was first, then we did the POS integration, then we did Apple Pay. So we phased it out, but we didn't compromise the customer experience. That was sort of the big thing for us. In terms of things that, you know, we would have eventually looked at Order at Table. That's one thing that was accelerated off the back of COVID, but something that sort of is, I think, unique to this that we probably wouldn't have done, maybe should have, is virtual queuing. So this idea of being able to go to a restaurant, scan a QR code, join a virtual queue, leave the queue, and then get a notification when a table is available. It's not a table reservation system. You're not physically allocating a table. That customers loved, because the Nando's guest experience is quite clunky in that you queue to get a table, and you then have to, once you're seated, you get up and order as well. It's counter service. You order and the food's brought to you. So you've got this double queuing piece, and virtual queuing takes some pain out of that. And then Order at Table takes out that second queue problem. So now the whole process is a lot more streamlined for the guest. But at the same time, an unintended consequence of that is you don't have the movement that we once had in a restaurant. So the environment doesn't feel as electric as it once did. So you know, it's, you know, there are a whole host of things, but I think virtual queuing is a good example of something that has had a really positive impact that we probably wouldn't have done if COVID hadn't happened.
Okay. Well, you know, that's right. But with all those things, with those challenges and things you want to done, you know, things are identified that become opportunities, which has been a theme of things we've talked about before. I'd like to just sort of shift on something else that you guys have talked about. I mean, you both have been in the industry with many organizations for quite a while. And, the common saying, is that, budgets never, travel as fast as the technology, right? But it seems like that might be different. I've asked this on each of the board calls we've done so far, but what is your leadership team saying to you today as far as your budgets and priorities now and into, let's say, 2022 or the second half this year versus where they would have been a year ago in February?
Lou, do you want to start with this one? And then
Yeah, nobody wants to answer the
All
budget.
right, I'll answer. I'm very fortunate. I've got a very tech forward thinking CEO who we have to throttle his ideas. He was the one that pushed us in 2017 to build out this digital platform. He pushed us to roll out Curbside when we told him that was a 10-year-old technology and we had probably missed the boat. We had a board that was pushing us in the loyalty direction. So I've had the fortune for the 7 years now that I've been at Red Lobster to work for a company that understands how technology can drive the business. And so I can honestly say nothing's really changed. The priorities have changed. We're still, now we're at a point where the investment since we've deployed the digital platform and we integrated loyalty into it as well as in restaurant, we've got the basic foundation for a great 360 view of the customer. And so now we're just thinking about, okay, now how do we mature that environment and what's the investment and the timing of those investments to start to close the gaps and really, kind of fine tune the implementation. So budgets really have not been an issue for me.
Yeah, and look, I guess from a Nando's perspective, at a board level, a lot of our market CEOs they're not really tech native. So we're not as fortunate as Lou. We don't have tech native CEOs. A lot of them didn't really get or appreciate the value that technology was bringing to the table. Fortunately, a major shareholder, the owner of the business, Robbie Eindhoven, does get it. And similarly, we're having to throttle some of the things that he wants to do. He's looking at robotics and automated ice cream dispensers, and there's all this funky stuff that he wants to invest into that's constantly coming across one of our tables. So fortunately, we have this voice that's constantly trying to innovate, and the CEOs have had their eyes open sort of over the last 2 years. And from a tech budget perspective, we have, as with every restaurant brand, pretty much, budgets have significantly increased year on year for the last 10 years, right? So, and more, effectively now we'll be in a position where all of our transactions, in the UK, we're talking about getting a restaurant live without a physical POS by the end of the year. So all transactions will be taken through some customer-facing digital asset. So if we're not investing in this, then what are we investing in? So I think, there has been a huge mind shift change, and we're starting to get to a place where we're no longer thinking about the sort of physical restaurant, and we're starting to think about this idea of sort of unified commerce, because we also have a grocery business where we sell sauces and things into supermarkets, and we're trying to think about how do we join this all up and offer a Nando's experience, whether you're in the physical space or a delivery or in a supermarket, that's consistent in the way that you want to engage with the brand. And for us to effectively do that, we have to be investing in digital. So I think everybody's on that page, but it's taken us a bit of time to get there. And if there's one, I guess, positive thing that you can take out of the last 12 months is that it's accelerated that journey.
Yeah, well, that's funny because the last part of what you said also keeps coming up, that, is it the chief information officer or the chief digital officer going forward, that everything seems to be going digital. And also what I just heard you say, if I heard this right, is you're looking at moving away from the physical point of sale into, there's been those concepts out there, of bring your own device, which could mean customer, employee, or tableside. And that may be the wave of the future. And if that is, then everything goes, to the cloud and is digital. And it just sort of changes the way we look at IT, not only in the applications and technologies and opportunities, but also in our staff, our suppliers, a number of things. I don't know if you guys agree or you want to comment on that, but I just think it's different.
No, I agree. I think there's this we're still going to need to take cash, right? And that becomes the sort of bottleneck. But there's some interesting stuff playing out in that space too, right? It's like the guys that provide kiosk for McDonald's, Acrelec have been purchased by Glory that do the cash handling, automated cash handling stuff, and they're doing, cash kiosks, really slick cash kiosks. So I think there are ways to handle taking cash within the physical restaurant that don't require a typical POS and a cash drawer anymore. And so if you can suddenly decouple the POS, which to be honest is probably the bane of everyone on this call's lives, it really unlocks a lot, right? And that's sort of the vision that we're going after.
Lou?
Yeah, I again agree with Vic. I'm a firm believer that BYOD for both employees and guests is the future. Is that going to happen in 5 years, 10 years? I think the last 12 months, as Vic stated, has re-educated, or in some instances educated people on how to digitally engage with just about any retail transaction. And that's no different for restaurants. As the hotels open, it'll be very interesting to see what changes happen in the hotel space. Certainly airlines jumped on that bandwagon 10 years ago with, hey, my ticket's right here, I get all my alerts right here, and I don't even have to be in your loyalty program, and I don't even have to download your app in order to take advantage of that. So, I think that is the wave of the future. And I also agree with Vic on the point of sale, as well as Rob, what you were implying, and that is, networks today are becoming much more cost effective with regard to speed and redundancy, which then dramatically increases reliability. I think, again, in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see the plethora of hardware endpoints that exist in all of our restaurants move to a virtual cloud existence, as long as people have confidence in the network.
Right.
You're still going to need some level of technology at the restaurant, but it's not going to be the size footprint that we have today.
Well, you bring up an additional point that's come up a number of times in conversations with people. You mentioned the hotel industry, and of course, many of these industries, and I read an article recently on blockchain, how it's been on the news in the last 2 weeks about how the airlines are connecting with the hotels, are connecting with the restaurants for a seamless transition of information sharing and food and safety. But these industries are connecting. I'm wondering what you guys are seeing in North America or anywhere else, that you believe is going to be the future from other industries that are going to have an impact that we ought to be following. What technologies or initiatives do you think we should be following or learning from others on, since you brought it up, Lou?
Look around. We're all trying the Amazon effect, right? We're all trying to get to, hey, people who ordered this also ordered that, or people who, it's the Amazon taught everybody how to do it. Now we're all playing catch up to get there. If blockchain becomes the next enabler to link transactions as a workflow together for an individual to make it more seamless to travel, whether it's for business or pleasure, if the code's being cracked somewhere overseas, it'll become a global trend pretty quickly, and then the rest of us will have to play catch up. um, you know, I think that's just the way of the world.
So Vic, putting you a little bit on the spot here, you can answer that question as to what you've seen from other industries, but quite frankly, you also have mentioned your market CIOs who, and you mentioned, for instance, that you have been doing, what was it, delivery or curbside in certain parts of the world for a long time. So besides what you see in other industries, are there some experiences or things you're getting from your market CIOs in other parts of the world that you might want to share or you think could in fact be very helpful to know about, regardless of where you are on this call?
Yeah, look, I think the big things that I see emerging, the federated nature of the business I work for means that we're tackling the customer facing proposition slightly differently in each market, right? And actually there's some great stuff that's coming out of the back of that. So the way that we're doing suggestive ordering, the way that we're laddering in loyalty, the end-to-end experience, actually our markets not using the same solution and almost going up against each other is creating this competition that's actually quite a good thing, right? So we're almost pushing ourselves to be better. And we actually are looking outside of the hospitality industry for inspiration. So if you look at fashion retail, for example, and how the disruption that fashion retail went through 10 years ago, and just look at the ordering process of a H&M or one of those brands, and how curated and personalized that feels, but also the way they do suggestive selling and upselling and how that's laddered into the experience. I think that's really interesting, right? And also, some of the big purchases that McDonald's have made, looking at laddering in the predictive, the predictive, structuring the menu based on the weather and location of where you are, all of that kind of thing. There aren't many brands that have done this yet well, and I think there's a big play to make in, if we're saying bring your own device is the way forward, what does that experience look like for the guest? So that's one big piece. And then the other big piece that none of our markets are seriously looking at, but I think as the cost gradually, as the cost is coming down, we need to start looking at, with increasing labor pressures, where does automation sit within our restaurant environment? And, people, whenever I say that, our CEOs, their eyes glaze over because it sounds like it's not achievable, but there are companies out there that are actually doing some pretty amazing stuff with automation. And we're looking at it quite seriously. So, there's a company in the UK called Karakuri that's doing a whole host of stuff for Ocado, which is an online supermarket where they're doing last mile delivery, but they're effectively producing salad boxes to order via this device called a DK10 unit. And so we could automate a number of processes within our kitchens and take labor out to make the restaurants more cost effective. And I think that's another big play, looking at, learnings from the manufacturing industry and industry 4.0 that the restaurant bridge. And I think that will manifest itself in cloud kitchens first, and then potentially scale elsewhere.
Well, I think that brings us to a great lead into sort of the open mic discussion of this virtual meeting. What I would ask is all of our attendees, if you don't mind, to undo your mic and your video so that we can see who's here and everybody else can see you. And I'm just going to lead with a particular observation and thought that just came out of the last two pieces here. We have a number of suppliers, who are equal members and equal seat at the table in our organization. And I'm sort of wondering if we asked you the same question, or maybe you open up the discussion as to, what you're seeing out there, in other industries that you think might work, because many of you work in other industries, or you just see some cool stuff. And what do you believe that we might, you heard from our panelists, and we'll hear from other speakers, but what do you think we might think about? And I would just add to that it is interesting how times change, because prior to COVID, there were some interesting arguments, debates, or discussions having to do with getting rid of workers and everything. But I think the concept of robotics and self-attended operations and micro markets has certainly changed in the last year. So maybe they're acceptable. Anyway, if any of our suppliers want to just sort of add in what you guys have seen or are seeing.
Sure, Rob. It's Teresa Murphy with Panasonic. There is a lot of attention being paid to, and a lot of interest in things like everybody's saying food lockers. We're seeing, a lot of folks that want to try it. It's, it's a little bit technical, right? You have to look at the POS system. You have to look at, what type of integrations that they want to do, things like that. So it's like not just being able to say, put in a locker and here you go, but it really is beneficial, for say that third party pickup that's not going to go away. It looks like it's only going to increase. So, if you look at QSR, which is the majority of our business, it takes that third party out of the drive-through line. So the speed of service picks up for your customers that are coming through the drive-through. Because we're hearing numbers now like 80 to 90% of the business in the drive-through versus 60 to 70 just a year ago. So it's a big increase, but it also has them come in into the lobby to not have to go to your front counter either. They could go to a locker. So there's a lot of benefits there. It's just expecting if you want to standalone or do you want it integrated? There's all different ways to look at it. And then of course there's cost associated with it for, like monthly fees. So some folks, understand a lot of more, costs could come with it and others,
Well, the fee models are certainly going to change no matter what, because even suppliers who were offering certain and we're not going to discuss pricing today, but but who were offering certain types of pricing models prior to had to change those given the economic pressures and their models that were there. Any of other suppliers that's not necessarily your own stuff, but just interesting innovation that you see out there that you want to add, that perhaps you look at the world differently and you have a different scope than the operator side does?
Hey, Rob, it's Bob Gibson. I think one of the things that's been really interesting over the last, say, 6 months or so is opening up APIs. So part of the barrier to getting companies into the market, right, was restrictive pricing models from most of the POS vendors. And we've seen a pretty dramatic change in that, where even Oracle's opened up their APIs. So that's been a nice shift. So as we're looking to do integrations with, large chains of ours, it's going to make the cost of entry for both the restaurateur and for the vendor that much easier to play with within the marketplace. So that's been, I think, a direct result of COVID, and it's kind of been fun to see.
Anyone else? Okay.
I have a comment, Rob. Question. It's regarding what Vikram was saying. I think you're right in the sense that the automation can come in many forms, right? Like some processes might be automated and all that. But expanding on that, what do you guys think of real automation, like with robots? Like you've seen Flippy, for example, or there was a salad making robot that I personally don't think it's life-changing or anything, but do you guys see in especially Lou or Vikram, since your operation are very well established and big, what do you think that at some point that will be industry changing? Or
I personally, I think it will be. The problem is somebody's going to have to suck up the R&D cost of this thing. That's the problem, right? So there may be a small first mover advantage, but the cost of taking in a scalable way is going to be significant. So, we have gone through the process with a number of engineers from Imperial College here in the UK and looked at what would it take to automate a Nando's kitchen. And it's not necessarily sexy robotic arms. It's conveyors and things that shake to dispense and all these kind of things, right? It's not actually that. It's not as you expect when you talk about automation, but in theory, you could automate a load of the processes and a load of the workflow.
But like a CPG manufacturing line.
Yeah, exactly. And we're talking about millions of investments. And
yes.
in a if you think about the number of restaurants, the CapEx cost per site, and with labor costs being relatively low, it's a difficult economic equation to balance. That fundamentally is the problem. But I think we'll get there, though, right? I think it's some point.
The interesting thing, Vic, the interesting thing on that is that nobody ever said our industry had to make all that investment. Sometimes the better way to get there is to go look at another industry that already made the investment, like healthcare makes lots of investments in certain types of things, or the military. Your education, they made the investment in autonomous delivery on campuses and stuff like that. So sometimes you just got to steal from another industry to get the
Borrow.
technology you want, right?
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Robert,
Yeah,
this is
no,
Fuller
no,
from
Fuller? Yeah, I'm
From
sorry, I'm
Maryland.
at the University of Maryland. Go to it.
As soon as you said that, I was like, well, that those robots that are right downtown from where I am, they haven't picked up greatly in my industry, in my space. So, I definitely listen to it and pay attention to it. But your point is well taken that other people may do the investment and do the R&D and do the development. And definitely in my area, we definitely try to borrow from others. And for us, it's a closed system. I happen to be self-operated, which makes a big difference. And but it also limits the resources, because I can't take something and automate it and then duplicate it across a bunch of restaurants. It's like, I got one restaurant, I got 3 dining halls, I have the concessions at the stadium, and none of the technology goes across all of those different businesses. So it's very challenging when it comes to automation. But I will say, as Robert was saying, it's definitely talked about in our circles, the robots delivering the food. I don't know what's happened since COVID, because I've just been dealing with my own stuff. But the point that you just made is, yeah, let other people do the development.
But self-service for you in micro markets is probably something that you are enabling on campuses that you can see in airports and other.
Definitely. And speaking of some of the, the third-party vendors like Grubhub that are doing that, obviously eat up all the profits, but they're actually developing a type of point of sale that we're going to actually look at implementing in our environment. So that should be quite interesting. It's all self-service, point of sale. We're going to do it at our Chick-fil-A location, and see how that goes. Well, it'll be interesting.
But I think to Vic's point, though, whether it's you or somebody else in your industry or somewhere in another industry, you're still talking about major capital investment just to bring the proof of concept to life, and then the time that it takes to then really refine that proof of concept to something that can be repeatable and scalable. I mean, in our restaurants, I can't tell you how many tens of thousands, millions of Cheddar Bay biscuits we've made in the, in the 50 plus years that we've been in business. But, we look at that process and we say, that would be perfect for an assembly line type CPG machine tied into your order transaction system. So it's automatically making the number of biscuits that you need for every order. And it's not just, like a 15-minute potato chart. And that you dump the water in the mix on one side and the biscuits come out the other side. We've looked at that and the investment, and there is a bread machine out there that's making bread. To Rob's point, the U.S. Navy's investing in it and putting it in all their ships. It would pretty much fill up this wall in my office, a 10x8 thing, and it's very, very expensive. We have looked at that, or even something. We had this idea where, hey, what if you could take a lobster tail, a frozen lobster tail, because you actually have to split it, pull it out, cut it, right? What if you could just dump the box in, it goes in a chute, it feeds the lobster, it goes through this cutter machine, and out the other end comes the prep lobster. Again, looked at that. I mean, the investment just to
there'll be a lot of innovation in that, and hopefully the lobster tails won't end up in the cinnamon toast crunch. But George, you're up.
Yeah, can I just add to that conversation? I think great points are made, but it sounds like to me that it's, and this is what I've seen too, is that once a restaurateur finds out exactly what is his greatest pain point, then they start focusing on that. So instead of doing the whole kitchen, it literally becomes pieces of the kitchen. And then, you focus on that and you try to make it easier on a go forward and see how that, so it's bite-size implementation, if you will. That's I guess what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, George. The driver behind our two ideas was, of course, reducing labor, number one, better
Right.
quality and consistency of the biscuits, number two, safety. I mean, when you're cutting lobsters, your fingers get cut. I mean, you're in a kitchen. So those were the drivers. And to your point, we haven't looked at automating the entire back of the house production for Red Lobster, but we have looked for those individual pain points, and
Sure.
I'm
Lou,
sure
I
there'll be
was
solutions that come to market.
Yeah, Lou, I was more addressing how Vikram had looked at the entire back of the house. And I was suggesting that that's, I think, what most operators are going to do. And most restaurateurs will take a look at it. And I guess it's technology's point to figure out where's the biggest pain point.
Yeah. So like for us, we started at like what feasibly seems solvable. So automated loading of the dishwasher and unloading of the dishwasher, frying, right? Like actually you've got automated chip dumps anyway that dump the chips into the basket. Could we lift the basket out, fry it, tip it out into a chip dump ready for salting? These things are all doable. And actually to some extent, some brands have already done it. McDonald's invested quite heavily in automatic frying, but they dropped that project because they realized that there was more money, there was more to go after in automating drive-through order taking, which is why they invested in that voice AI company, because now when you drive up to the speaker box, they'll automate taking of your ordering via voice. And that's a bigger play than automating frying. So even the big guys, I think, are picking their battles. And if the McDonald's are picking their battles, then a 1,300 restaurant chain has very little chance at this stage. But I do think, give it 5 years, I think we'll see some weird stuff. I think I do genuinely think we'll start to see some things being automated in the kitchen environment.
Well, I think
I'm curious. I'm going to drag Gary Brunsman into this conversation because, Gary, I know you were.
You are, but you got 2 minutes.
I know you were part of Panera 2.0. Is there anything that you see out there in the marketplace?
I mean, I think what you all are talking about is valid. I think it's going to come piecemeal, depending on each restaurant and really looking at the affordability and the practicality of it. But, there may be opportunities. What I found interesting was the article about Taco Bell's a new prototype where they've got the kitchen above and they're using these conveyor or dumb waiters to drop the food down. That expands their drive-through lanes. I think that's interesting. I'd like to learn more about that or how expensive that is. But by putting the kitchen up, they're up to 4 drive-through lanes. I think that's a very interesting idea, and they've got some type of technology to drop the food down.
Yeah. So listen, we're at the end of our time, but I'm just going to, because Gary just brought that up, I am going to point out one thing for you. There's 2 ways that I've always told people, well, 3 ways that you can go ahead and predict the future or figure out what you want to do. One is look at other industries, such as travel or hotel, like Lou said. Another one is to go take a look at what the big guys are doing, which is what Vic just said. McDonald's is leading in certain areas and investing, or Disney, for that matter, invests in a lot in robotics and stuff. So they do that, right? And then really the third area, which people overlook, are the up and comers, the new startup restaurant people who never were in the business before, but they just decided they're the ones who come up with the ghost kitchens, and they're the ones who come up with the tablet technology, and they're the ones because they don't know any better. And all of a sudden they're a big POS company, or the online ordering guys who started, they're now the POS guys. So we shouldn't forget that sometimes it's a little guy who had no experience who can think outside the box versus the people that have all the experience, to do that. So with that, I just wanted to point out that we have some upcoming events coming up. The Western Food Service and Hospitality Expo in Anaheim in August, as of right now, still on, and we hope that it will be. And we'll be doing some conference programming there, and also hosting perhaps a reception or getting some people together. Florida, which I highly suspect will never get canceled. no political discussion there. But because Lou's there, it will never get canceled. So that's in Orlando in September, and FS Tech in Texas in September. And then there may be some other things that we participate in as well. And we hope to have some in-person chapter meetings, certainly in the third and fourth quarter, at least one before the end of the year. I really want to thank Vic and Lou for leading this discussion today, and for all of you for attending and putting your input in. And as always, that's really what this is about. And if you want to get in touch or look at further resources, please reach out to the IFBTA. And thank you very much for attending today, and have a great day.